My name is Whytli, and I'm a survivor of sexual and mental abuse. I had a boyfriend for a year and a half that was extremely abusive and took advantage of me and caused a lot of severe trauma, hurt, and mental instability. Earlier this year, I released my #NoFilter story where I shared my struggles with anxiety and depression. At that time, that was considered my no filter story, but now I am taking off another filter as I've become more aware. When I decided to share that video about my mental illness, I had only been detached from my abusive relationship for a week. I was actually using it as a distraction from my heartache, as it took all of my attention and energy. And in that video, I didn't mention being in a relationship because I wasn't fully aware of the impact he had on my mental state, and I wasn't ready to step back and evaluate that because the breakup was still raw. But shortly after releasing that video, I finally snapped out of his manipulative spell as I took on life without him always whispering in my ear, telling me what to think. I came to a lot of realizations as I made new friends and learned what healthy relationships looked like. Some things that I remember kicking in were like, good boyfriends take you out on dates and treat you right and don't ignore your objections and pleas. Or your boyfriend, it's not okay for him to pin you down forcefully and make it so you can't breathe. Or that sex is supposed to be enjoyable and not leave you feeling violated, used, and worthless. And all of those held true for me. So early on in the relationship, I remember him really controlling every aspect of my life, one thing at a time. It started with him getting rid of my best friends. He would tell me that they were not good for my mental health and used my depression against me. He isolated me to the extreme where he was the only person in my life. I had no one else to go to or talk to when the abuse got bad. He was by my side 24/7, and that propelled my social anxiety because he made sure I knew I couldn't do anything without him. I was so dependent on him to the point where I was only living for him. He was my boyfriend, my best friend, and my abuser. The sexual abuse started small. He groomed me and took baby steps, pushing my boundaries and forcing his wants onto me. But once you give an inch, he wants a mile, and so it escalated quickly to the point where he was raping me on a weekly basis for a year. He would try to justify his abuse with excuses such as his 8-year pornography addiction, and he would say that he just couldn't resist me. So then he would continue to rape me and live out his pornographic fantasies. Or he'd use excuses saying he was going to marry me and that it didn't matter if I got pregnant because we were going to get married in the future. A lot of people think that rape is only a violent attack in a dark alleyway by a stranger, but rape can come from a significant other, a spouse, or even a family member. It's anything that's non-consensual or against your will, and for me personally, it was a constant battle of coercion, taking advantage of me when I was depressed and suicidal, undressing me against my will, and using physical force. I begged for it to stop. He knew I didn't want this. I tried saying no, but he told me that he doesn't take no for an answer and that he didn't like that word. As he continued, these behaviors and violations of me and my body, he used a pattern of lying and manipulation of those around him to really hide everything that was going on and what he was doing to me. He had fine-tuned his tactics of breaking me down and abusing me into every single word he said and things he did. He also abused me mentally, such as using my insecurities against me. He would tear me down to the point where I was sobbing hysterically, only to build me back up and act as if he were my savior in front of my parents and really anyone watching. This is called traumatic bonding, and it confused me because I thought I needed him. I thought of him as my lifesaver, but really, little did I know, he was drowning me. He manipulated my mindset as he told me repeatedly that I was unlovable and that he was the only person capable of loving me after seeing my worst anxiety and depressed state. Looking back, the timeline fits up perfectly, and I was able to make the connection that the first time he sexually assaulted me in February of 2017 on Valentine's Day was the same month that my anxiety and depression got out of control, and from then on my mental state deteriorated as the sexual abuse got worse and worse. He had used me, played with my mental state, and then he was done with me. When we separated, I hit rock bottom. I had 48 hours of complete and utter hell where I tried to commit suicide 4 different times. I had reached a breaking point. The abuse ruined me. I could not even bear living anymore. But I'm still here. I believe I was kept safe so that I could become an advocate for abuse and speak up about the ignorance that the world has portraying this issue. Even within a couple of days of cutting him out of my life, it was a night and day difference. The weight of my anxiety and depression lifted, and I became empowered and gained my sense of self back almost immediately. Although I did start to gain my identity back, I was having traumatic episodes and multiple triggers months later. So I now see an EMDR therapist where we work through those triggers and help scale back the trauma of being raped and abused. But I've struggled a lot with blaming myself and looking back at all of the warning signs. I've come to the conclusion that this was not my fault. This was not my parents' fault. I didn't bring this upon myself. I can't beat myself up because at that time in my life, that was all I knew. I didn't have the knowledge and understanding of what abusive relationships look like as I do now. It was my first boyfriend, and I didn't know any better. But just because we were dating does not mean he owned me and my body. Does not mean he had the right to violate my boundaries. Does not mean I ever owed him sex. Does not mean that this was okay. I'm not sharing this out of spite or revenge. I'm sharing my story because it is my story. As I've opened up to people close to me, I've had some misunderstanding where they tell me to forgive and forget or to move on with my life, but it's not that easy. People have a hard time understanding what abuse and abusive relationships feel like and look like unless they are in one themselves, and they don't realize that this will affect me for the rest of my life. This doesn't even scratch the surface of my story, but I cannot stay silent. I have become so passionate about being an advocate for mental illness and abuse. I am starting a podcast because I have so much more to say. I'm going to elaborate on my story, and I'm going to make my voice heard whether the world is ready to listen or not. To anyone watching that has been abused or taken advantage of, you're not alone. It isn't your fault. You're worthy of real love. And there's hope for a happy life free of constant abuse.